The reality is to bring you such a terrific program of speakers and panelists requires a lot of work from a lot of people. David Abel has a magnificent team at the Verdi Exchange Institute who do terrific work, but he also has important partners and sponsors who make a conference like this possible. And one of our most important partners for many years in this conference has been the New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization from Japan. Many of you have heard from its leader, Furukawa-san, at past conferences, and he had hoped to be with us today, but he is called to a very important business in Japan, and he has sent his more than capable number two to address us, and I hope you'll give him your respect and attention as he has come from a long way to share the important work of NEDO with us. NEDO, for those of you who don't know, works to share Japan's considerable know-how and technology solutions to fulfill two basic missions: addressing energy and global environmental problems and enhancing industrial technology worldwide. NEDO has been a supporter of this Verdi Exchange Conference for many years, and it is also supporting important research and demonstration projects around the world, including here in California. Furukawa-san sends his apologies, but I would like to introduce Takahiro-san, his important number two, who has been with Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry for more than 20 years. He's been covering issues from medical devices and biotech to leading NEDO's global cooperation in advanced energy technologies in his current position as Director General for International Affairs. He has a degree in engineering from Tokyo University and a master's in international relations from Columbia University. And he will present a brief update on NEDO's important work over the past year. Would you join me in please welcoming to Los Angeles and to Verdi Exchange, Mr. Kazushi Takahiro.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Bill, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much, Mr. David Abel, for giving me this precious opportunity to share what NEDO is doing. So I am Katsushi Takahiro of NEDO, and NEDO acknowledges that the Verdi Exchange Conference is always one of the best places to meet the best and brightest people who are eagerly working on environmental issues. So our chairman, Furukawa, really regrets that he had to cancel his participation today due to an urgent business. So on behalf of him, I would like to present our primary efforts towards future energy systems very briefly. So over the last 10 years, renewable energy and low-emission vehicles like fuel cell vehicles and EVs have expanded more rapidly than we expected. Not to mention, these are technologies which will play an important role in solving energy and environmental problems, and also will be a promising driver for future economic growth. Along those lines, NEDO conducts various demonstration projects globally, including two here in California. So let me introduce the two projects. The first one is EV project named Drive the Arc. We installed 55 fast chargers at 25 sites along highways between Monterey and Lake Tahoe. We just completed construction last November. The slogan is surf to ski emission-free, meaning no range anxiety. Through this project, we will contribute to achieving California's goal of 1.5 million EVs on the road by 2025, as well as the SB 350 goal of 50% renewables energy by 2030. The second project is to introduce a redox flow battery in San Diego. The system has various advantages, such as high response speed, long-term storage capacity, and high safety level. The system is expected to supply 2 megawatts for 4 hours. The construction has been completed last year, and it is already in operation. So we have received a lot of site visits from various stakeholders. So we are sure that this technology can contribute to increased introduction of renewable energy in California and the entire United States. The next topic is hydrogen. As you may be all aware, hydrogen is clean. It can be produced in various ways, and it is a great option to provide flexibility to power grids. Fuel cell vehicles have a long driving range and a short fueling time. As you know, the Toyota's Mirai and the Honda Clarity are on the market, and the number of hydrogen fueling stations are rapidly increasing all over the world. Japan is one of the few countries taking the lead in this field, with 100 fueling stations, 2,000 FCVs, and 220,000 fuel cells for residential use, called NFarm. So Japanese government is fully committed to realize what we call hydrogen society. Last month, ministers released the National Hydrogen Strategy to show its long-term vision to achieve a hydrogen society in 2050 and its concrete action plan until 2030. The plan covers its production, supply chain, and usage, including for electric power, and the final goal is to reduce the cost to the level same as conventional energy like gasoline and LNG. Along those lines, NEDO and the US Department of Energy agreed to collaborate on hydrogen and fuel cells last October. NEDO and the DOE will share data on topics like the safety of fuel cell vehicles, and the fueling stations. At the Tokyo Olympic in 2020, the athletes' village will be hydrogen-powered, and the fuel cell buses will transport people to events. So we hope that this momentum will be continued, and the 2028 Olympic in Los Angeles will be a great showcase of what United States will have done by that time in this field. So lastly, let me touch upon events by us. We always enjoy the Verdex Exchange conference, but taking into account its importance and the rapid change in this field, I think once a year is not enough. So every year, around October, Japan's Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry, METI, and NEDO host the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, or ICEF. Last year, more than 1,000 people from industry, academia, and government from about 80 countries or regions attended in this event. So next meeting will be on October 10th and 11th. I'm sorry, I forgot. And we would be very much delighted if you could come to Tokyo in October. So we think the future of smart communities and the hydrogen society is not so far away. But to achieve those, strong political will is indispensable. So in this regard, Japan and California already have a great cooperative relationship, and we hope that Japan and California will play a leading role in the field globally in the field of energy and environment. Thank you for your kind attention.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce a great friend of this conference through the years who will be moderating our luncheon panel to provide you with some food for thought along with the meals at your tables. Jim Kelly retired from Edison International in 2011 after almost 38 years of service to the company. Prior to his retirement, he was Senior Vice President of Transmission and Distribution for Southern California Edison, responsible for the operation and maintenance of electrical grid comprised of over 12,000 miles of transmission and 100,000 miles of distribution lines spread across a 50,000 square mile service area. He was also president of Edison ESI, the subsidiary company that operates one of the largest electrical and mechanical repair facilities in the U.S. And Jim Kelly was also one of the early pioneers of the smart grid, developing a roadmap for a smarter, safer, more reliable, and more environmentally responsible electric grid. So we think he's the perfect moderator for this luncheon conversation about the roadmap to the utility of the future. Would you again give your attention to the stage and welcome Jim Kelly to moderate our luncheon panel.
Thanks, Bill. Well, I'd like to ask our distinguished panel to come up and join us on the stage. And as they're coming up, to save some time, I'm going to introduce them briefly to you. But if you at all operate in the energy space in California or the Western U.S., you know all these people. If you don't know them, you've been living in a cave. We are thrilled to have President Mike Picker, President of the California Public Utilities Commission, Commissioner Leanne Randolph from the CPUC, Dr. Bob Weisenmiller, the Chair of the California Energy Commission. And we're being joined by our utility guest, who's going to be our keynote speaker, Mr. Kevin Payne, who is the CEO of Southern California Edison. I think all of you know, if you follow all of the publications in the energy industry, that Edison recently released kind of a landmark white paper describing a vision for Southern California to meet or even exceed all of the ambitious greenhouse gas goals that we have in this state. Edison's kind of done a blueprint which is both fascinating and thought-provoking and provocative in some regards, and I think raises some questions that we're going to try and deal with. So we're going to let Kevin have the microphone now and tell us about Edison's vision, and then we'll kick it around with the rest of our panel. Would you welcome Mr. Kevin Payne?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure to be able to tee up this discussion between President Picker, Commissioner Randolph, and Chair Weisenmiller. As much as I hate to start any talk with a disclaimer or fine print, I do have to just let everybody know that here in California, if you're not aware, we have rules about ex-parte communications between utilities and decision makers, and so my comments will necessarily be high level today and stay out of any existing proceedings, and as we answer questions from the crowd later on, we may have to do the same. So I guess my theme here today, first off, could you tell me how many of you, by a show of hands, have read the Edison white paper that was released a few months ago? All right. Hopefully we see a lot more hands before you leave here today. We really intend it to be a great start to a very important discussion here in California. And this is a really, really exciting time in California. There's just no question that California is leading the way on protecting the environment, and we have a very progressive vision. In many ways, the title of this panel could really be not the roadmap to the utility of the future, but roadmap to the society of the future. because in essence, that's what it will take for us to meet our environmental goals here in California. 40% greenhouse gas reduction below 1990 levels by 2030, 80% by 2050. And I'm sure all of you noticed the huge step that was taken on Friday when Governor Brown announced a target of 5 million zero-emissions vehicles. A bold step forward, I think, in creating this vision of the future. However, we do all have together a huge challenge, I think, today, and that is that this is 2018 and 2030 is only 12 years away. And if you think about where we were 12 years ago, that was when the movie An Inconvenient Truth was put out. And look at how fast that time went. And we're talking about a very significant transformation of the energy sector and society to make these 2030 goals. And I will tell you that I believe it is possible if we are willing to take the steps to get there. So I would suggest to you today that all stakeholders need to commit to the goals fully. We need to come together on a path forward, and we need to take some bold actions. So I believe that the utility of the future is uniquely positioned to provide the clean energy that's necessary for our carbon reduction goals. Just speaking for SCE, we're well ahead of the 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2030. We're ahead of pace on that. The electricity generation sector has reduced by 24% already, and we're now only 19% of California's total greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look at that, it makes it very clear that decarbonizing the electric sector is not enough. We need to start looking to all the other end uses across other sectors, and we need to leverage the now cleaner and progressively getting cleaner electric power system to help fuel those end uses. 80% of the opportunity is in other sectors, primarily transportation and space and water heating in buildings. And we think that those are really important areas of focus for us. And we think the electric utility of the future has unique opportunities to contribute to our success in these environmental objectives. So as Jim mentioned, SCE has produced a vision for how we get there. And importantly, the vision is in the context of get there in the most cost-effective way to customers. These are aggressive visions, they're aggressive transformations, and I think we owe it to all the people that we serve to make sure that we pick a path that will get us there in the most cost-effective way. So we call this the Clean Energy and Electrification Pathway. And this was based on some analysis and research that we've done on all the possible ways that you could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and what would be the most cost-effective combination of those things. So we came to the conclusion, as you'll see in our white paper, that we should move over time to 80% carbon-free energy. So that's different than renewable portfolio standard. We're at about 40% carbon-free today. So that would be doubling the amount of carbon-free energy flowing over our grid today. And then use that clean energy to power many other end uses. We think that some of those end uses include 7 million electric vehicles or zero emissions vehicles for the whole category by 2030. It is the largest greenhouse gas source today, and I think it is the obvious one that we need to tackle and go after in a very aggressive way. And it was great to see the governor come out with the 5 million zero emissions vehicles target last Friday. On top of that, there are many other benefits from other types of pollution that result in cleaning up that sector. We think that electrifying space and water heating in about a third of our buildings is key to success and is an economic way to go after this problem. These uses alone are 2/3 of all the greenhouse gases that come from all of our buildings. So it's a sector that's ripe for transformation. We need to double energy efficiency in homes and buildings. We're going to need new code standards, incentives, et cetera. And most critical, I think, to this entire pathway is that we need to keep rates affordable for customers. And we need to redesign rates in ways that allocate costs fairly across all of the customers and yet facilitate the clean energy options that we'd like our customers to ultimately adopt. So as I've said, 2030 is coming fast. And achieving our goals is going to require fast decision making and collaboration across sectors. So where does everyone here fit in? public policymakers, I would suggest that what we need is comprehensive policy. We need proactive and bold decision making. Stakeholders, we all need to align quickly on the near-term actions that are needed. We need a systematic approach, and we need to be ready to compromise. Nobody's going to get everything they want in this pathway. Customers will need to adopt new technologies. We will have to get more of their mind share on energy issues. We have very little of that today. And they will need to be open to change, new technologies, new rates, new activities. Utilities, we got to help make this happen. We got to support state policy, build the necessary infrastructure, and help our customers make clean energy choices. There are many other stakeholders, and everybody has a role, and commitment is the first step. So, let's leverage our clean energy infrastructure and work together to build a path to success. We are the 6th largest economy in the world here in California, and we have an opportunity to create a blueprint that others can follow. We can be successful, but only if we start now. 12 years left to 2030. So our intent in putting out the white paper was not to say that that's the only formula, and just for example, 7 million electric vehicles is only less than a fourth of the cars in the state of California. There's plenty of room for other options, other technologies, changing and adjusting along the way. But we think that what's important about the white paper is to start the conversation about identifying and following a specific path that results in specific near-term and bold actions. So we're ready to take those bold actions, we're ready to change, and we're ready to help make things happen. So I'm looking forward to hearing the perspective from our other panelists. And thank you very much today for your time and attention.
Well, thank you, Kevin. And I'm hoping that if you haven't, I saw a number of you didn't raise your hands. If you haven't read the white paper, you're going to look it up on the internet. It's easy to find. It's on the Edison website as well, right? And read this white paper, because it's one hell of a challenge for all of us when we think about changing California in this radical way. But of course, I mentioned it's provocative. So we want to hear from our regulatory experts here, the people who have this fiduciary duty to be overseers for all of us and make sure that it's done right, it's done economically, and get some opinions from each of you on this vision, this kind of a pathway for the future in California. So in no particular order, President Picker, you want to start off?
Sure.
Go for it.
So I always get a little confused at these conversations about the utility of the future in California, because we've had that utility of the future since 1998, when the legislature designed a deregulation of the electricity industry and essentially made the electric utilities sell off all their generation. So since 1998, they haven't owned generation. They procure it in a series of bilateral markets with long-term contracts. It's not a bad strategy. Under that rubric, we've actually sited, built, interconnected, and enjoyed 20 gigawatts of wind and solar here in California. That's pretty amazing in under about 10 years. And I think that it speaks to the ability of a centralized procurement strategy to actually move quickly and to get to scale. So I think we have that piece of it. The thing that we don't have is a rate structure that goes any further than 1940. So we actually allow these utilities to recover their expenses for all of their operations and for these procured contracts under the same stale legislative framework that we had in the 1940s and 1950s, which is they get to charge based on their volumetric sales of electricity. So I think that people were aware that as you started to see other players step in the years 98 through 2001 by intent, the intent was actually to have other people provide for the service of electricity and the utilities to manage the wires and the poles and the meters, that it gets kind of hard to make sure that you're actually pursuing all your goals, including reliability. There was a little bit of a market problem in that period under the framework that the legislature set up, and people couldn't get electricity to meet the needs at the margin. And as the markets got tighter, people started to play games. And they really, really, really hurt ratepayers and the solidity of this infrastructure here in California. So the legislature stepped back and said, no, we're not going to disaggregate the providing of electricity. We want that centralization. And we're going to create this thing that we call resource adequacy, and the three big utilities are going to become the vehicles, along with the publicly owned utilities, for making sure that we have that. So at the time, though, a guy named Ralph Cavanagh from NRDC sort of realized that that worked against all of our policy goals, that allowing the utilities only to recover their expenses based on this volumetric sales of electricity failed to provide for energy efficiency. Because if they get paid for selling more electricity to cover their costs, clearly there's an efficiency in the market of having them sell more electricity. Energy efficiency is all about less electricity. So they decoupled. So things start to get even a little hazier and crazier on this compensation side of the equation. And as new technologies start to come into the market, things like rooftop solar, fuel cell batteries funded by state programs like the Small Generator Incentive Program, the California Solar Initiative to put solar on 1 million California roofs. Customers are actually starting to be able to use technology to meet their own needs. And as this increases, of course, that challenges the ability of the utilities to actually pay for their costs. So we're sort of at the point where we're going back to 2000, 2001, but without a real strategy. 5 gigawatts of solar behind the meter on top of this 20 gigawatts of renewables certainly helps us to get to our GHG goals and helps us to get to our renewables goals. One California utility, years before the 2020 goal of 30%, actually served 40% of their electricity from renewables. That's pretty strong. All the utilities expect to be at that 40% goal by 2022, 2024. Most of them will hit 50% well before 2030. And to reach our state's GHG goal, we'll probably be at 60% renewables. So the challenge, though, is that as customers depart for all these other different places that they can get their own electricity, whether it's direct access providers or clean community aggregators, rooftop solar, behind the meter gas fuel cells, all the different technologies are out there. There's fewer and fewer customers to pay for the costs of the utilities. What is it that the utilities become? They become a platform to support all these technologies. Now, I think there's enormous value there. If you think about other platform industries like Google, Amazon, Facebook, the value isn't in the individual provider that uses that. It's in the aggregate platform. So the utilities will continue to play a role, but they can't do it. They can't continue to develop as that utility of the future until we decouple their rate structure from the vehicle that we want them to be to run this grid. So I'll just kind of drop it there, let you guys ask questions. There's a lot more. We're actually thinking long and hard about what the right kinds of vehicles are, but there are many challenges that I don't think that we are actually dealing with straight up.
I promised you provocative. That was certainly a teaser for it. Commissioner Randolph, what do you think?
So every time I appear on a panel or something with President Picker, I always get nervous that we're somehow going to be sort of duplicative of one another. And then he always comes up with these like incredibly bold statements. And I'm like the lawyer sitting here going, okay, now I'm going to tell you the practical reality of some of the sort of day-to-day issues we're dealing with at this moment in time. So that is the role I will play here. I will, when I think about the utilities and our relationship with the investor-owned utilities, you know, we are really asking them to be incredibly nimble in incredibly new ways. And coming from the state agency with the reputation of probably being the least nimble, it is kind of ironic that we are asking the IOUs to be very, very nimble. But we look at our integrated resources planning process, where we are really trying to, instead of focusing on a specific percentage of renewables or specific technologies, we are focusing on a greenhouse gas emission target. We are setting a target. We have a proposed decision coming up in at our February meeting of a proposed target of 42 million metric ton reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And we are asking our load-serving entities, investor-owned utilities, and CCAs to procure to that target. And that's requiring a lot of intensive analysis and modeling of how we get there, what are the resources we need to get there. But that planning process was mandated by SB 350, and what that legislation asked us to look at was not just what the target is, not just what the resources are to meet that target, but as Kevin mentioned, cost. We need to be cognizant of the costs, of the impact on ratepayers and getting there in the most cost-effective way. We need to be cognizant of air pollutants. We need to understand what the emissions effects of our portfolios are and what choices we can make to reduce those effects. And we need to put a priority on disadvantaged communities. We need to understand the physical impacts on disadvantaged communities. We need to understand the environmental justice impacts on communities, but also we need to be mindful of impacts on individual low-income customers who may or may not be in disadvantaged communities. So we have a lot of issues that we have to weigh, all underpinned by the importance of maintaining reliability, of having a system that keeps the lights on while still achieving those goals. So trying to balance all of those things in a practical way in the integrated resources planning proceeding and also in the resource adequacy proceeding, which is also assigned to my office. We're really trying to kind of make these trade-offs in real time and trying to reach those goals. So we have a fairly heavy lift.
Dr. Bob, what do you think?
Well, I think back to the governor's State of the State a few years back, where he basically set the goals of 40% reduction based upon at least 50% renewables, doubling energy efficiency, reducing petroleum use by 50%, also addressing short-lived climate pollutants and addressing the challenge that so much of our forest and rangeland have gone from being a sink for carbon to a source. And basically frame the challenge to all, laid out the existential challenge of climate change and said we really need to look at transforming our society. Basically transforming what a utility means, transforming what a regulator means, transforming what our communities are. And it's a huge lift. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So part of it is indeed to encourage Edison and all the utilities to think through how do we meet that challenge? And as my fellow commissioners have talked, how we have to transform how we do business. So many, the example of the IRP is very good in the sense, people have done IRPs forever. You can go back to at least 1970-ish, when Edison was doing IRPs in a very public setting, but they were not focused on greenhouse gas emissions, really.
Right.
They weren't focused, it was very siloed. It was not, well, what about the transportation system? It was very much, let's look at the grid part of it. And so it really is an all-encompassing challenge, to really connect the pieces. We're doing similar things at the Energy Commission. We've done building standards since 1977. We've saved, Californians billions and tens of billions of dollars through that, really led the nation on the energy efficiency side, but they're very focused on saving energy and being cost effective. Now, the question is, how do we rethink those in the context of greenhouse gas emissions? Now, obviously, we need to stay cost effective. We need to stay practical. We need to update those. But we really have to work through all of our systems. And it's at a time where we're actually experiencing the consequences of climate change. At least one of our utilities has announced no more dividends, and pulling back on investments. So we really face, as a state, very fundamental challenges. And Los Angeles has its own unique issues. I mean, obviously, a lot of your economy is goods movement. So, when we talk about the 7 million vehicles, that's got to include a lot of trucks, a lot of that goods movement transportation. And so, how do you really continue to grow the economy, but in a sustainable fashion? I mean, that is the challenge that we face now, and we're going to continue to face for the next decade.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, let me throw one out that Leanne touched on, and you've all heard it from me at various times, Mary has too, that concerns me, right? All these EVs, that sounds pretty cool for this audience here, and getting rid of site combustion of fossil fuels, replacing with electric, which becomes increasingly clean, that sounds really good too. How are we going to deal with our low-income communities, our historically underserved population, our multifamily dwellings, people who don't have the capital? They're not going to go out and buy EVs. In fact, their cars are just going to get older and dirtier because they can't afford to change them out. They don't have charging infrastructure. How are we going to deal with that whole segment of our population as we try to do this great sort of visionary high-tech thing? And that's not directed at anyone in particular. I just like some thoughts because it worries me.
Well, I mean, I think, we try to promote programs that try to reach out and encourage all consumers to take advantage of this. I mean, our expenditures that we have approved for charging stations have certain percentages set aside for disadvantaged communities and multifamily dwellings, and so we try to have an eye to that as part of our programs. But it is challenging. I mean, one of the differences between the IRPs of the old days and today is that now the customer is a huge player, right? The customer is choosing different things. No longer is the utility able to know, okay, this is exactly what my load is going to be, because the customer is going out and choosing direct access or CCAs or whatever, and it makes it more challenging in that planning. And so, to your point, making sure that all customers have the opportunity to understand what those choices are and to be able to make those choices, and also to be mindful of the customer that doesn't want to make the choice. The customer that's just like, I want this on autopilot, I don't want to have to deal with this. I just want to pay my electric bill and not have to worry about this. Mm-hmm. And sort of recognizing that we need to make sure that those customers are able to achieve the benefits of a clean economy and not be burdened by a clean economy is really critical.
Indeed. Did you want to address that one, Kevin? Or?
Yeah, well, I was going to say one of the things I want to applaud LAWP on is obviously one question in life is what do you really measure and count? And they've developed metrics that try to track what they're doing across all the community. Really? And I mean, that's something which the Energy Commission and PUC at this point are also coming up with, okay, what is the reliability? Where are these rebates going? I mean, they may or may not be embarrassing statistics, but once you know, that forces you to take action to make it more equal.
Another thing that I think our tendency is to say, well, that's just too darn bad, but we've got to be realistic. A significant portion of our California economy is based on the petroleum industry, It's based on other fossil fuels, natural gas industry, and so forth. When we look at this transformation and people aren't driving gasoline cars anymore, the trucks are moving off diesel, more water heating's being done electrically, there's going to be shifting all over the place, right? For example, Kevin and I were talking about the fact that right now, what maintains our roadways? The tax we pay on gasoline. Well, we're going to stop paying that largely, right? How do we deal with this displacement, this structural displacement? Because historic industries that have employed our people and fueled our economy, pun intended, are now going to be diminished, and we want them to be in many ways. How do we deal with that and the equity of that situation?
Charge ratepayers.
Yeah.
I think you're talking to the wrong group. I mean, we're special function agencies. We're designed to be very focused and very limited. I'll give you examples of why I think it's going to be a challenge to ask us that question. The legislature required the CPUC to tell the utilities to do certain kinds of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And so I think it was very short-sighted. We're putting a lot of chargers in people's garages and in basements of multifamily housing where they're never going to get used, or where their maximum use will be 4 hours a week, because they're just inaccessible to what most people are doing. And on the other hand, I had a conversation with the head of the Employment Development Department who's really struggling to figure out, as people move into not just one job per day, but 3 jobs per day, what's the flexible kind of transportation for people who can't afford any kind of a vehicle, or who would like to get out of an aging beater that's highly polluting. And he knows where people live and where they work. We have no idea at the CPUC. We know what the utilities do. The utilities themselves are just following the legislative direction. Where's the grand strategy? Where is somebody saying that rather than just doing bus rapid transit in San Bernardino with CNG buses, that they should be electrified and the utilities should be building the catenaries? Where is the similar strategy in the South Bay? So, you know, there's a little bit of a challenge for us sitting where we sit with the regulatory framework to do that. You want to ask me what I would do if I didn't have this job. I have lots of great ideas, but there was a former president who had a lot of great ideas and wanted to do them, and he got in trouble for that. So we stick and color within the lines these days at the PUC. You want us to color outside the lines, then you get the legislature to give us a little flexibility.
Okay. We're working on that. Great. Well, you know, in the time we have left, we've got 10 or 12 minutes here, I think, and we've got a couple of folks who've got wireless mics out there in the crowd, and we would like to let any of you, please don't make long statements about your political beliefs or what your company sells. Wrong place. But genuine questions for our policy leaders up here. Let's take a handful of them. Don't be shy.
Yes, I guess this question's directed more to Kevin, but we understand that with the change in the new tax law, that the utilities are going to be able to make some savings. Are you planning to invest those savings in accelerating your investment in technology, or reducing the rates?
Sorry, we're grabbing that and giving it back to ratepayers.
Well,
it's already done.
It's done. Thank you very much.
All right. Good question and great answer. So, isn't President Picker one of the most fun panelists around? So, all right, another one. I can't see very well with the lights, but when they give you a mic, stand up and fire away. I see one over there in the middle. There we are.
I come from the waste side of things, and I see this brave new world of electrification and batteries and all sorts of new systems. we weren't very good at managing the waste problem in California, and I'm wondering what all you are going to bring to this before it fully manifests, and then we're figuring it out in rearguard action.
Well, we're looking very closely at this challenge of how do we meet the state's goals in an area where we don't have that centralized procurement that dominates all of the issues. So how do we make sure that there's enough electricity on those 15 really hot afternoons when the solar goes away and the peak goes up? I mean, the phenomenon that we have to really recognize here in California is people are using less electricity. There's less electricity being used in California. At the same time, it's cleaner, but there's bigger peaks. And so you can't procure 100% renewables just for those peaks and then let them sit the rest of the time. So how do you get to that? And how do you actually make sure that as everybody turns to individual providers of electricity, that when you put it all together, there's enough to keep the grid alive? What happens to those low-income customers that nobody wants to serve? Nobody's going to go out and compete for many of those families in the Central Valley who are just scraping by. How do you make sure that we hit our green goals? If everybody is trying to compete on least cost, how do you make sure that we're actually then putting money aside from all these people to do the battery storage, to do the electrification of transportation? All these questions have yet to be answered. So we have a project at the CPUC that we call a customer choice, and we're looking at other examples of how people have dealt with that. But it comes very clear at some point that we have to relieve the electric utilities in some way of their duty to either provide electricity to everybody so that it becomes a fully competitive market, or we have to have some other vehicle by which they're compensated for those things that they do, and where they don't have to actually back up these other providers constantly and become the dumping ground. So those are some of the issues that we hope to actually have discussed in a paper. I think we're a ways away from proposing solutions, but we'll look at models elsewhere. Texas, where they just ripped the Band-Aid off and said by such a date and such a date, you will pick who's going to sell you your electricity, or we'll assign you somebody. Illinois, where they had a whole lot of local municipalities who became the electricity aggregators, although they didn't run the wires or the platforms. And they actually backed off of that because they were starting to see that the costs were getting out of control. England, where they spent about 15 years tweaking it, and the dominant utilities provided all these services under a different kind of a rate structure. And New York, where you can get your electricity from anybody, but the state does the central procurement through NYSERDA. So there are some solutions that we think we can craft if we agree on what the challenges are and begin to look at where the best practices are elsewhere.
Great. Thank you. Let's take another one. Do we have any other hands out there? I can't see you if you are, so wave your arms. Yep. Oh, we have a couple coming here. Okay.
So California has just come off of somewhat of a building boom for renewable energy, and we're at a situation where we have a lot of renewable energy resources and maybe didn't have an especially coherent policy for how all of them are going to fit together. What do we need to do in California in order to integrate all of the existing resources that we have and continue to plan for the new ones that will be coming online?
Well, I think, that's one of the key goals of the integrated resource plan is to understand what do we need besides just wind and solar, right? I'm trying to understand what our ramping needs are, what resources we need for our peaks, and trying to get that system to fit together. And as Bob was talking about this morning, I mean, there are opportunities out there to reach outside of California and try to figure out how we get the most cost-effective and efficient renewable integration. And all those solutions need to be on the table and discussed and determined, because it can get expensive if you try to do it all by yourself. And we are trying to keep costs down.
Yes, indeed. We have time for one more quick one. I saw a couple other hands. Anybody else? Over here, I think.
What is California doing, or does California need to do anything given the weak federal role right now in climate change and kind of promoting sustainability and sustainable electrification?
Well, obviously, the governor has taken a real leadership role on the international scene, and it's very important for us to deepen that role. I mean, there's going to be a major event, international event in San Francisco in September, where we anticipate all the members of the Under 2 MOU and people from around the world coming to look at lessons learned on what we've done right in California. Things like putting a price on carbon, things like building and appliance standards, things like renewable procurement, things like ZEV initiatives. So again, we're only 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. We might as well go home if we don't influence the rest of the world.
Wonderful.
And I think the state has an important role to play in research and development. We just recently approved $400 million of expenditures of EPIC funds to do research. And stepping up where we may start seeing the feds stepping back, I think, is an important role for the state.
We're really the Robin Hood in that process. We take that money from the regulated utilities and give it to the public, to the CEC. So we don't spend it ourselves.
Yeah. So we spend it wisely.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you join with me in thanking our panelists?